In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the body cavities that are found on the dorsal and ventral surfaces of the body and the membranes that are associated with each of these. So let's just dive right in. So the dorsal body cavities are the cavities that are found on the back side of the body. That's what dorsal means. So if you think about the movie Jaws and how the shark goes swimming through the water and you can see the fin sticking up above the water, that's the dorsal fin of a shark. It's found on the dorsal surface. So the dorsal body cavities include the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. The cranial cavity is, and these are two, they are closed, they're connected to each other, but they are completely closed off. So there is no communication between the external environment and these two body cavities. The cranial cavity, it's enclosed by the bones of the skull. We refer to those as the cranial bones. And it holds the brain. It's the protective, it's the space in which we find the brain, protected by the bones. The vertebral cavity, also referred to as the vertebral canal, is enclosed by the vertebra of the spinal column, and it's in the interior, inside the vertebral canal, we find the spinal cord. So the bones have a hole in them through which the spinal cord is able to pass, and so the vertebra protect the spinal cord there inside this passageway. And the membranes of the dorsal body cavities are referred to as the meninges, and there are three layers of connective tissue that surround, enclose, and protect the spinal cord and the brain. I should include that in there, and brain, because there are meninges surrounding the brain as well. And when we get to the nervous system, we'll look more closely at the three layers of the meninges and try to make more sense of them. So pretty straightforward here with the dorsal body cavities, cranial cavity and the vertebral canal, with the meninges surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity also is a closed cavity, and there are two closed subdivisions separated from each other by the diaphragm. So here's the diaphragm. It is a layer of smooth muscle that separates the thoracic cavity, that's the upper cavity here, from the lower cavity, which is the abdominal pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity has two closed cavities within it that are separated from each other by the mediastinum. So this area here is the mediastinum, right there. That was bad. It's hard when I get to the edge of my pad where I'm doing this. So I'm going to let you rely on the spelling right here to know exactly how I spelled that. So the mediastinum is fibrous connective tissue, and it encloses the heart, the esophagus, and the trachea. So esophagus, that's the tube through which food goes down into the stomach. The trachea is the tube through which air gets into the lungs. So these two cavities here are referred to as the pleural cavities. Pleur, this root here, is a reference to the lungs. So the pleural cavities house the lungs, and there's a right pleural cavity on this side here and a left pleural cavity there on that side. The abdominopelvic cavity is inferior to the diaphragm, that is, it is below the diaphragm, and it contains all of the organs that together we refer to as the viscera. The stomach, the liver, the large and small intestines, the spleen, the pancreas, all of those are the viscera. And we can further subdivide the abdominopelvic cavity into the abdominal cavity. That's everything that's above the brim of the pelvis, superior to the pelvis, and inferior, superior to the brim of the pelvis, there where you put your hands on your hips, and inferior to the diaphragm. And the pelvic cavity It's not, there's no physical separation here, but it is partly enclosed by the bones of the pelvis. And that's where we find the bladder, the internal reproductive organs, and some parts of the small and the large intestine are also found there in the pelvic cavity. So two separated enclosed cavities, the abdominopelvic cavity here in the inferior portion of the ventral body cavity, and the thoracic cavity here in the superior portion of the ventral body cavity. And so this is all referred to as the ventral surface of the body, opposite to the dorsal. So the dorsal surface is the back, then the ventral surface would be the belly side of the body. And that term ventral comes from a term that we associate probably more with lizards and with birds than with humans. But lizards and birds, the reptiles, have a common orifice through which both urine and fecal material and reproductive products pass, and that's referred to as the cloaca, also sometimes called the vent, and it's here on the belly side of the animal. And so that is the term that we associate now with the belly side of the human body as well, the ventral surface of the body. So there are also some additional small cavities that are open to the external environment, and they're all associated with the head. There's the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, oral cavity, hopefully you get that means the mouth. The nasal cavity, that's inside the nose and up into the back of the throat. And associated with the nasal cavity is the frontal sinus and the sphenoidal sinus. So the frontal sinus is associated with the frontal bone here at the front of the skull, and the sphenoidal sinus is associated with the sphenoid bone here around the eye. So when we have sinus pressure, we can feel it up there in the lower forehead and kind of around and behind the eye. There's the orbital cavity. This is where we find the eyeball. It is found partially protected by the bones of the orbital cavity. And then finally there is a cavity associated with the middle ear, and it is directly open like the sinuses into the region of the throat that's up and back, right, sort of up above where the mouth and the throat meet, and back behind, where the nasal passages are leading back into the throat as well. So multiple body cavities found in the human body. Some of them are closed so that they don't communicate directly with the external environment. These are the dorsal and ventral body cavities, while some of them are open to the external environment. And these are those small cavities associated with the head. So on the ventral body cavity side, we need to talk a little bit about the membranes that are found associated with these with these body cavities. And they're referred to as serous membranes, and sometimes also called the serosa. They are a double layer of membrane. There is the parietal serosa, and you'll want to practice with that word. That's one that I find people have a hard time saying, because you look at it and you want to say parietal, but it's parietal. So I'll say it a couple more times and you can say it back. So, if anybody's around you who's looking at you as you speak to your computer, it's okay. So I say parietal, so you say, hopefully you said parietal. I say parietal, you say, okay, this time say it with conviction. I say parietal, you say, all right, very good. So the parietal serosa, these are the serous membrane. This is the serous membrane that lines the cavity wall. So, if I'm thinking about, say, the cavity that surrounds the heart, so here's the heart, and the parietal serosa is the lining here, and then the rest of this is the mediastinum. So there's mediastinum, and then there's the wall of the cavity itself. And that would be the parietal layer of the serosa that surround the heart. There's also a visceral serosa, and this is the layer that doubles back, and so if these are the arteries and veins coming into and leading out of the heart, it doubles back and covers over the actual organ. So this layer would be the visceral serosa, while this layer here that's lining the wall is the parietal serosa. Hopefully that makes sense now. So in between the visceral and parietal layers, there's a little space. And it's into that space that these membranes secrete what is referred to as a serous fluid. The serous fluid is thin, very kind of slippery because there's a lot of protein in it. There's even some enzymes in there that help to maintain that slipperiness. And it reduces friction as, for instance, in the case of the heart, as the heart is beating, it doesn't scrape against the rough connective tissue of the mediastinum. Instead, it glides past as the heart with its slippery visceral serosa is relaxing and contracting, relaxing and contracting. It will just slip on across these very slick layers of the parietal serosa. And this serous fluid is found in the cavity that's associated and is in between the parietal and visceral membranes. And the serous fluid is produced by the cells, by special secretory cells that are found within those serous membranes. Okay, so now let's look and try to explain the three different types or three different serous membranes that are associated with the ventral body cavities. The first is the membranes that are surrounding the heart. And so these are referred to then as the around cardial heart, around the heart membranes, the pericardial membranes. The visceral pericardium, and this picture, this image that I have is taken from the book, and it is a slice through the body in the transverse plane. A transverse plane is like cutting across the body. So it's like we've stood up a person, we've made a slice right about heart level, and then taken the top half of or top portion of the body off. So the head, the shoulders have come off along with the arms. And all that we're seeing now, we're looking right down the barrel of the trunk of the body. So these would be the lungs, and here we have the heart. So this area here is the heart. And right up against the heart muscle is the visceral pericardium. So here we have the visceral pericardium. You can see it right here. I think you can see that little dot that's moving around. Here against the mediastinum itself is the parietal pericardium. So here the parietal pericardium extends all the way around, if you follow my little dot, and completely surrounds the heart. And it lines the mediastinum parts that enclose the heart. And in between the two, somehow I lost this little arrow here. In between the two is a very thin space that is filled with pericardial fluid, and that is the pericardial cavity. So here this heart sits inside the pericardial cavity, and as it relaxes and contracts, the heart is able to slide very easily within that pericardial cavity. So huge purpose here in lubricating the movements, reducing friction of the movements of the heart, the pericardial membranes. Okay, so same image again, but this time we're looking at the lungs, because the lungs are also found covered with visceral serous membrane. This time, though, we use the term pleur. So we've already introduced that term. We know that pleur is associated with the lungs. So the visceral pleura is a serous membrane that completely covers and surrounds all the lobes of the lungs here. So I put a little red line, but you can imagine it goes all the way around if you follow my little red dot. So this is the visceral pleura right there. The parietal pleura, the visceral pleura wraps all the way around here. The parietal pleura lines the wall of the thoracic cavity. So here we have it lining the wall, first of the mediastinum, but also out here now, right up against the muscles of the chest wall, and then kind of wrapping around the mediastinum again. So that is all of the parietal pleura. And then in between, in this very thin little narrow space, is the pleural cavity filled with pleural fluid. And again, it's there to, actually it has a different function, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about the respiratory system, but that won't be until next semester, so in the springtime. We'll talk about the function of the serous fluids there with the pleura. And then last of all is the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavities, which are surrounded by and found inside the peritoneal cavity. And so we talk about them as the peritoneal membranes. Peritoneal membranes they're large, and they completely cover and surround all of the organs that are found within the ventral body cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the visceral peritoneum covers over all those organs, while the parietal peritoneum, here it is lining the body cavity wall. So here we have, we're up against the fat that's there padding the kidneys on the back side of the body. So here is that parietal peritoneum completely covering the body wall. And this slice through the body is made a little bit lower down. You'll see that there is no heart, but we can definitely see the aorta headed here down the body. And here's the inferior vena cava coming up from the legs to bring blood back to the heart. So we're down below the heart, the level of the heart now, and we can see a little slice into the stomach. Here's a little slice into where the small intestine leaves the stomach. Here we can see another little bit of small intestine as it coils back and forth. We can get a lot of the liver right here. That's what all of this large stuff is. Here is liver. We can even see a little bit of the gallbladder. So all of that right there, here, this outer layer that lines the body cavity wall is the parietal peritoneum. But here where it covers the liver, that would be visceral peritoneum. And where it's covering the stomach here, that's visceral peritoneum. And where it's covering up the spleen over here, that would be visceral peritoneum. And in between these is a fair amount of fluid called the peritoneal fluid found inside the peritoneal cavity. And so if you've heard of the disease peritonitis, that is when these membranes become inflamed and aggravated. So you get inflammation of the peritoneal membranes is peritonitis. Pleurisy is when we have infections associated with the pleural membranes. All right, so there it is. The body cavities, some of the naming conventions around the body cavities, and around the membranes associated with each of these body cavities. All right, as always, don't hesitate to ask me questions, and you know how to reach me. Bye.